At exactly 10:17 on a bright Tuesday morning, a little girl stood in the middle of a crowded hospital garden, staring at a red butterfly that had landed on her hand. Her father watched from only a few feet away, holding his breath, because for 3 years he had dreamed of hearing just one word from her. Any word. Daddy. Water. Help. Even a meaningless sound would have been enough. But the little girl remained silent, her lips trembling as tears rolled down her cheeks. Her father dropped to his knees and whispered, "Please, just give me one chance to bring my daughter back." Behind him stood a man nobody expected to become part of their lives, a quiet, scarred single father and former Navy SEAL who had survived war, loss, and years of darkness. He looked at the child, then at her desperate father, and made a promise that would change all three of their lives. Before we continue, if you believe that kindness can give someone a second chance, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to Epic Story Hub. Your support helps us bring more emotional stories of courage, family, and kindness. Now, let's return to that sunny hospital garden, where an impossible promise was about to begin. The little girl's name was Maribel, an 8-year-old with bright brown eyes and a smile that had once filled every room she entered. Her father, Everett, had been a successful businessman, but none of his achievements mattered anymore. 3 years earlier, Maribel had been riding in the back seat of their family car when a terrible accident changed everything. Everett survived with injuries that healed slowly. Maribel survived too, but something inside her seemed to disappear that day. She stopped speaking. At first, doctors believed it was temporary trauma. Then weeks became months, and months became years. Specialists came from different cities. Therapists tried different methods. Nothing worked. Maribel could understand everything around her. She could write. She could draw. She could laugh softly when she thought nobody was watching. But whenever she tried to speak, fear seemed to close around her throat like an invisible hand. Everett spent every morning searching for another specialist, another treatment, another possibility. That Tuesday, he had brought Maribel to a rehabilitation center known for helping children recover from severe emotional trauma. The appointment had ended badly. Another specialist had gently told him that forcing Maribel to speak could make things worse and that healing might take years, perhaps longer than anyone could predict. Everett walked outside carrying the same heavy silence he had carried for years. Then he saw Maribel in the garden with the butterfly. For one beautiful second, she looked peaceful. Then the butterfly flew away, and Maribel's expression changed. Everett noticed tears on her face and felt his heart break all over again. That was when he noticed the stranger sitting beneath an old oak tree. The man was wearing a simple gray shirt and jeans. He had a faded scar near his eyebrow and the unmistakable posture of someone who had spent years learning to remain calm when everything around him was falling apart. His name was Rowan Mercer. He was 41, a single father, and a former Navy SEAL who had left military service after losing several close friends overseas. Unlike Everett, Rowan never talked about his past unless someone asked. His life had become quiet. He lived in a small house outside the city with his 12-year-old son, Callan, and worked occasionally as a wilderness safety instructor. He had learned something during his years in the military that no battlefield had ever taught him: sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was simply stay. Everett approached him because Rowan had been watching Maribel with unusual attention. Everett expected a stranger to offer sympathy, but Rowan only said that the girl looked frightened, not broken. Those words struck Everett harder than any medical report. He asked Rowan what he knew about children like Maribel. Rowan admitted that he was not a doctor and could not promise a medical cure. But he understood silence. His own son had once stopped speaking for several months after Rowan returned from deployment. Callan had been very young, and Rowan had come home carrying invisible wounds that frightened the child. Rowan had spent countless days sitting beside him without asking questions, without demanding answers, simply showing him that silence did not mean abandonment. Everett looked at his daughter and then at Rowan. His voice cracked as he asked the question that had lived inside him for 3 years, "Can you make my daughter speak again?" Rowan looked uncomfortable. He knew the answer should have been no. No honest person could guarantee such a thing. But then Maribel looked toward him. There was something in her eyes that reminded him of Callan, of a frightened child desperately searching for proof that the world was still safe. Rowan finally told Everett that he could not promise to make her speak, but he could promise to help her feel safe enough to try. Everett stared at him for several seconds before saying, "Then please help her." "I'll give you anything." Rowan shook his head and replied that he did not want money. He wanted Everett to understand that his daughter did not need to be fixed like a broken machine. She needed someone willing to wait. The following morning, under a clear blue sky, Rowan arrived at Everett's home. He did not bring medical equipment or complicated exercises. Instead, he brought a small wooden birdhouse he had built with Callan. Maribel sat at the kitchen table drawing pictures. Rowan placed the birdhouse beside her and started painting it without saying much. For nearly an hour, the two worked in silence. Maribel watched him carefully. She seemed surprised that he wasn't asking her to speak. Over the next several days, Rowan returned. Sometimes they painted. Sometimes they walked through the garden. Sometimes they simply sat outside in the warm daylight listening to birds. He taught Maribel small breathing exercises disguised as games. He showed her how to make paper airplanes. He asked her to point instead of answer. Slowly, something changed. One afternoon, Maribel handed Rowan a drawing. It showed 3 figures standing beneath a bright yellow sun. One was a little girl. One was a tall man. The third was a boy holding a dog. Rowan recognized himself, Maribel, and Callan. Underneath them, Maribel had drawn a small red butterfly. Rowan felt tears rise in his eyes, but he did not make a big deal of it. He simply smiled and taped the picture to the refrigerator. Then came the day everything nearly fell apart. Everett had received another disappointing medical report. His frustration finally overwhelmed him. He wasn't angry at Maribel, but his fear made him desperate. He entered the garden carrying the report and told Rowan that they needed to do something more. He wanted results. He wanted proof that this was working. Maribel heard the tension in his voice and immediately froze. Her hands began shaking. She dropped the pencil she had been holding and backed away. Rowan looked at Everett and quietly told him to stop. Everett realized his mistake too late. He knelt beside his daughter, apologizing through tears. He told her that she did not owe him a word. She did not owe anyone a miracle. He only wanted his little girl to know that he loved her, whether she ever spoke again or not. That afternoon, Everett sat beside Maribel beneath the same oak tree where Rowan had first met them. The sun was warm, the garden was quiet, and for the first time in years Everett stopped looking at his daughter as someone he needed to save. He simply looked at her as his child. He held out his hand. Maribel slowly placed hers inside it. Days passed. Then weeks. One sunny morning, Maribel and Callan were outside building a small garden shelter for birds. Rowan was repairing a loose wooden board while Everett watched from the porch. A red butterfly suddenly appeared and landed on the same flower Maribel had been staring at weeks earlier. She smiled. Callan laughed and pointed toward it. Maribel stood very still, watching the butterfly move its wings. Then something unexpected happened. She opened her mouth. At first, no sound came out. Rowan immediately stopped moving. Everett stood frozen on the porch. Maribel tried again. Her face tightened with fear, but this time a tiny broken sound escaped her throat. It was barely more than a whisper. Everyone remained completely still because they were terrified that even the smallest reaction might frighten her into silence again. Maribel looked at Everett. Her lips trembled. Then, with tears filling her eyes, she whispered one word. "Daddy." Everett collapsed to his knees. He covered his face with both hands and sobbed like a man who had been holding his breath for 3 years. Rowan turned away for a moment, wiping his own eyes. Callan stood beside Maribel, smiling through tears. Everett reached for his daughter, but he did not pull her into a desperate embrace. He waited. Maribel walked into his arms herself. The next months were not magically easy. Maribel did not suddenly become talkative. Some days she spoke a few words. Other days she returned to silence. There were setbacks, fear, and difficult therapy sessions. But now there was a difference. Silence was no longer a prison. It was simply a place she could visit before finding her courage again. Rowan kept his promise, but not because he had somehow performed a miracle. He had helped create a safe place where a frightened child could discover that her voice belonged to her. Everett also changed. He stopped measuring his daughter's recovery by the number of words she spoke and started measuring it by the number of times she smiled, reached for someone's hand, or walked confidently into a room. One bright afternoon several months later, Maribel stood on the front porch holding the wooden birdhouse Rowan had brought on his first day. She looked at him and smiled. Then she said something that made everyone laugh and cry at the same time. She told Rowan that the birdhouse needed a better roof. Rowan smiled and said that perhaps she was right. Everett watched them from the garden, remembering the desperate promise he had once asked a stranger to make. He had believed his daughter needed someone powerful enough to save her. Instead, she needed people patient enough to wait for her. And Rowan, the former SEAL who had faced danger in places most people could never imagine, discovered that his greatest act of courage was not surviving a battlefield. It was sitting beside a silent little girl every morning and believing in her when she could not yet believe in herself. If this story touched your heart, please like the video, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to Epic Story Hub for more stories about courage, kindness, family, and second chances. Sometimes one small act of patience can change an entire life. And before the story ends, comment "Hope" below if you believe that nobody should be given up on just because their healing takes longer than expected. Because sometimes a miracle doesn't arrive with thunder or bright lights. Sometimes it arrives quietly, on an ordinary sunny morning, in the form of a person who simply refuses to walk away. And sometimes the most impossible promise isn't the promise to make someone speak again. It is the promise to stay beside them until they find their voice for themselves.